at my own baby shower, with 40 of his relatives sitting in a circle around me, and a table full of tiny wrapped gifts nobody would ever get to open that afternoon. My husband stood up, took the microphone meant for the games we hadn't even started yet, and announced that he wanted a divorce because the baby I was carrying wasn't his. I want you to picture the exact silence that follows a sentence like that. Not the movie kind of silence where someone drops a glass, the real kind, where 40 people simultaneously decide to stare at their own hands so they don't have to look at you. And somewhere in the back, a chair creaks because someone shifted their weight without meaning to make any sound at all. And even the caterer standing near the kitchen door froze mid-step with a tray of samosas balanced on one hand, unsure whether to keep walking or disappear back into the kitchen and pretend she'd heard nothing. I was 7 months pregnant, sitting in a chair decorated with ribbons his own mother had tied that morning. Ribbons in a soft yellow, because we hadn't found out the gender yet, and she'd insisted, loudly at the time, that yellow was the color of new beginnings. And I remember the strangest thing wasn't the accusation itself. It was how rehearsed it sounded, how he delivered it with the specific cadence of a man who had practiced a sentence in a bathroom mirror more than once. Because real accusations, the kind that erupt out of genuine hurt and suspicion, don't usually come out that smooth. They stumble, they repeat themselves, they get interrupted by the speaker's own breathing. His didn't. His came out like a toast, evenly paced, almost gentle. And that gentleness was somehow the most disturbing part of the entire afternoon. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up. I sat there with one hand resting on my stomach, and I let him finish, because some quiet, cold part of me had actually been waiting for this exact moment for almost 6 weeks, ever since the day his mother had asked me, a little too casually over tea, whether I'd ever considered a paternity test, just for peace of mind, just so nobody could ever say anything later. At the time, I'd thought it was an odd, slightly insulting question from a woman who'd never once had a reason to doubt me in the 4 years I'd been part of this family. A woman who had cried actual tears at our wedding and told everyone within earshot that she'd finally gotten the daughter she'd always wanted. It took me 3 more days to understand her question wasn't a question at all. It was a plan being tested out loud on me before it was ever used against me. The way you test a knife's edge on a scrap of paper before you use it on something that actually matters. So I did the only thing that made sense to a woman who had spent 6 weeks quietly noticing things she wasn't supposed to notice. The calls he took outside on the balcony that suddenly stopped the second I walked in, always ending with the same clipped, unnatural goodbye. The new lawyer's business card I found folded into his jacket pocket while doing laundry. Not a divorce lawyer, an estate lawyer. The kind you hire when there's a will and property involved, rather than a marriage falling apart. A distinction I only understood after quietly searching the lawyer's name online at 2 a.m. while he slept beside me, breathing evenly, completely unaware that the woman lying next to him had already started building a case of her own. I noticed the way his cousin, a quiet accountant who normally never came to family dinners, had suddenly started showing up every single week, always finding a reason to end up in a low conversation with his mother in the kitchen, while everyone else sat in the living room. I noticed, most of all, the way his mother had started speaking to me with a strange new gentleness in those 6 weeks, the kind of gentleness people perform right before they do something they already know they'll need forgiveness for later. I hired my own doctor privately, discreetly, weeks before he ever said a word about paternity, driving to a clinic 2 towns over so nobody in the family's usual circle of doctors and receptionists would recognize my name, and I had a prenatal test done that could confirm what any court would eventually need confirmed anyway, the kind of test that can be done safely before a baby is even born. And I brought the sealed results with me that day, in my bag, sitting under a stack of unopened baby gifts, because some instinct told me I might need them sooner than I expected. And I remember sitting in my car in that clinic parking lot after the test, staring at my own hands on the steering wheel, thinking that I never imagined I would need to defend a child I hadn't even met yet, from people who were supposed to be that child's own family. So when he finished his sentence, when the microphone was still trembling slightly in his hand and his mother was already nodding along like she'd heard this exact plan rehearsed before, her expression arranged into something that almost looked like sympathy for him, I reached into my bag, pulled out the envelope, and asked his uncle, a retired judge who happened to be sitting 3 seats away and who everyone in that family treated with a kind of reflexive respect nobody dared question, if he would do me the honor of opening it and reading the result out loud, since apparently we were doing everything out loud today. I said it calmly, almost pleasantly, the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt, and I watched that calmness land harder on the room than any amount of screaming would have. The room that had gone silent for his accusation went silent again for an entirely different reason. His uncle looked at me for a long moment, then at his nephew still standing there with the microphone, then finally down at the sealed envelope in his hands, and he opened it slowly, the way people open things they suspect are about to change the temperature of a room permanently. He read the results in the flat, careful voice of a man who has read verdicts before, a voice that had clearly delivered difficult news across a courtroom bench more times than he could count, and the number on that page put the probability so far beyond any reasonable doubt that even the family members who'd clearly been prepped to nod along with my husband's story didn't know where to look anymore, their eyes darting between the paper, my husband, and each other, searching for a version of this moment that made sense and finding none. I watched my husband's face do something I hadn't expected, because I had, honestly, braced myself for anger, for him doubling down, insisting the test was fake, was mine to fabricate, was somehow part of whatever scheme he'd already convinced himself I was running. What actually happened was quieter and somehow worse. He looked, for just a second, disappointed. The specific disappointment of a plan not working, not the disappointment of a man who'd just been proven wrong about something he genuinely, painfully believed. It wasn't hurt on his face. It was closer to the look of someone watching a business deal collapse. In that 1 second, that flicker before he rearranged his expression into something more socially acceptable, was the thing that told me everything I needed to know about what this had actually been from the very beginning. I turned to his mother, still sitting perfectly composed among the ribbons she'd tied that morning, her hands folded neatly in her lap, like she was at church rather than at the center of her own son's public unraveling, and I asked her, in front of everyone, why a mother would ask her pregnant daughter-in-law about a paternity test 6 weeks before her own son stood up and staged exactly this scene in front of 40 witnesses. I asked her to explain the timing, because I genuinely wanted to hear what version of an answer she thought could exist. She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because 2 people at that party already knew the answer, and their faces gave it away before either of them said a word. His cousin, the quiet accountant who'd suddenly started appearing at every family dinner, now looking very interested in the tablecloth in front of him, and an older aunt sitting near the back, someone I barely knew, who had, I would learn only weeks later through a conversation I never intended to overhear, recently rewritten her own will to leave a significant piece of family property to whichever grandchild carried on the family name legitimately, a phrase that had apparently seemed harmless to everyone in that family until it became the exact lever they needed to try to cut my child out of an inheritance before that child had even been born. Legitimately. That single word, repeated back to me weeks later by a cousin who felt guilty enough to finally tell me the truth over coffee, was the entire plan in miniature. Manufacture just enough public doubt about my daughter's parentage, early enough and loudly enough that by the time any paternity test could quietly settle the matter in private, the story that had already spread through the family would be the one people remembered, and a will already leaning toward exclusion would have all the justification it needed. I didn't scream that day, and I didn't leave the party early, because I had already decided weeks earlier in a doctor's waiting room, staring at ceiling tiles and counting them just to keep my hands from shaking, that whatever they were building against me, I was going to make them dismantle it themselves, in public, with their own faces on display for it, rather than give them the satisfaction of a private, easily rewritten confrontation behind closed doors, where my version of events could later be quietly edited out of the family's memory. I stayed for the rest of the shower. I opened 3 gifts before anyone worked up the nerve to hand me a 4th, unwrapping tiny socks and a soft yellow blanket with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and I let his mother sit there in a silence that grew heavier with every gift I unwrapped, because the only thing worse than being accused publicly is watching everyone slowly realize the accusation was never really about you at all. It was about money, wrapped in the shape of a lie small enough that they thought no one would ever bother to check it. A lie built on the assumption that a pregnant woman, humiliated in front of her entire extended family, would be too shaken to think clearly enough to have already protected herself weeks in advance. My husband filed for divorce 2 months later anyway. Not because of the baby. He never brought that up again, not once, in any conversation or filing or hallway encounter that followed. But because whatever he'd been promised for going along with his mother's plan clearly hadn't survived a paternity test read aloud by his own uncle in front of 40 relatives, and a family that had been willing to sacrifice an unborn grandchild's legitimacy for a piece of property wasn't a family inclined to reward failure gently. I kept the envelope. I still have it, tucked away in a drawer with the hospital bracelet from the day my daughter was born 4 months after that shower, healthy and unmistakably, undeniably his, whether he ever chose to believe it or not, whether his mother ever apologized or not, which she didn't, not once, not even at the small, awkward custody mediation months later where she sat 2 seats away from me and studied her own hands the entire time. I think about that afternoon sometimes, not with the raw anger I carried for the first few months afterward, but with something closer to a strange, settled clarity, because I understand now that the people who plan an ambush rarely plan for what happens when the person they've cornered was already 3 steps ahead of them, sitting quietly with a sealed envelope in her bag and absolutely nothing left to prove to a room full of people who had already decided, long before that afternoon, exactly what they wanted to believe about her and exactly what they were willing to sacrifice to make that belief convenient enough to act on.